Miyuki COF, and today I'm going to be talking about oil rigs. My main claim is that oil rigs have a negative impact on the world, and my secondary claims to back that up is firstly that oil rigs are destructive to the wildlife and the land, secondly that oil rigs create more water pollution, and thirdly that oil rigs create more air pollution. To back up my first claim that oil rigs are more destructive to the wildlife and the land is that the migration patterns of the animals are forced to be altered because of the oil establishments. A good example of this is that of the migration patterns of animals being disrupted is the Alaskan caribou, and more specifically the porcupine caribou. And according to PERC, which is the Property and Environment Research Center, Section 1002 is an area that is sectioned off in Alaska for oil rigs, but it is also the place that in many years the porcupine herd of 130,000 caribou migrate through this section where cows give birth to their calves. And opponents of oil development in ANWR contend that exploration and development threaten the herd. They point to evidence that some individual caribou in the Central Arctic herd have been harmed and contend that porcupine is more vulnerable because it is a much larger herd affecting a small area. Also, according to the Rainforest Foundation, oil extraction has contaminated what were previously some of the most biodiverse areas in the Amazon basin and have been used as an excuse to push indigenous communities off of their ancestral land. And the animals who live in these areas are also forced to change their living situation and their habitats, and the debris and chemicals have the tendency to cause damage to animals' organs, such as their livers, kidneys, spleens, or brains, and can also cause cancer, immune system suppression, and lead to reproductive failure. And also, for each new development of each oil establishment, the average is that 10 acres of vegetation is destroyed for every single oil rig that is established. So if there's hundreds of oil rigs across the world, that means hundreds of thousands of acres of vegetation is being destroyed unnecessarily. And my second claim of oil rigs creating more water pollution, there is one specific company that is doing this, which is BP, which is the British Petroleum, and they are the people responsible for the Deepwater Horizon spill. And the Gulf oil spill is recognized as the worst oil spill in U.S. history within days of the April 20th, 2010 explosion and sinking of the Deepwater Horizon oil rig in the Gulf of Mexico that killed 11 people. Underwater cameras revealed that the BP pipe was leaking oil and gas on the ocean floor about 42 miles off of the coast of Louisiana. By the time the well was capped on July 15, 2010, which was 87 days later, an estimated amount of 3.19 million barrels of oil had leaked into the Gulf. And a second oil leak from this company is more recent at the beginning of October, and about 95 tons of oil spilled 46 miles off the coast of Shetland, and the UK's Department of Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy decided to allow the oil to disperse naturally, and they have no intentions of picking up any of this oil. So it's affecting the marine life in the area, and obviously they have no say in the matter. And lastly is the impact of oil rigs on creating more air pollution, and the process used in fracking allows for a lot of contaminants to get in the air. And the NOAA, which is the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration researcher Steve Brown, was an advisor in the research that explained that the ozone on the Front Range comes from one main source, which is nitrogen oxide, and this is released in cars, trucks, and the industry. And the federal ozone limit was lowered last year because in certain areas of the country, the ozone was getting significantly higher than the federal regulation, and this is happening specifically in Colorado, and this is the state that has 6 major oil rigs alone in that state. And according to the Center for Effective Government, the oil and gas sector is the second largest source of greenhouse gases, and they let out 2 billion metric tons, or a third of the U.S. carbon dioxide rates every year. And these developments are different than like housing and agricultural developments because we need housing and food to live, but there are alternative sources such as electric and cellulosic ethanol, and we could use those instead of having to use oil for everything in our society. And just as a reminder, My claim is that oil rigs have a negative impact on the world, and that my secondary claims are that oil rigs are destructive to wildlife and the land, and that oil rigs are disruptive to the water pollution and air pollution.
All right, structurally everything's set up pretty clearly. You label the points as you get to each of them. There's an argument on the first point that says it's unnecessary, and then on your third point you discuss alternatives. I think that that might have been a place to maybe develop an argument, because there's a suggestion that we could replace the oil that is being derived from these rigs in some way, and so we don't really need it, and that's what makes it an unnecessary burden. That's a big premise, and if you're going to have that as part of your argument, I think it needs to be developed a lot more. The migration patterns thing, for instance, I think is a good example. That's a suggestion about why they shouldn't be doing exploration or development in Anwar. There's not really a demonstration that there's been a significant impact in the area that you're talking about. So there are these porcupine caribou. How have they been affected by the oil exploration or the oil rigs that are in that area? Are there fewer of them? Do they not birth as many as a result? Are they defective in some way? That's the thing that's missing from the argument. There's just the notion that something is in the way. I'm not sure that anybody's going to dispute that it might be in the way, but is it in the way so much that it has an impact? That's the thing that I think you need the follow-up information on. And then we go from Alaska down to the Amazon, so there's a big jump there, and the argument seems to be that in pursuit of energy resources, they're doing they get rid of indigenous people, and then there's going to be a consequence to the animal population as well. And that's very general in the information that you're presenting. There's no quantification of it except for the amount of acres that are involved for each rig that's involved. But that, the acreage doesn't identify the harm to the animal populations that is being talked about, and that it's an impact on that amount of acreage. I'm not sure how destructive it is in that acreage, and I think that needed to be developed a little bit more. The argument about the oceans, and you use the example of Deepwater Horizon, and then you've got a more recent oil spill that's going on, and where's the impact argument of that? That shouldn't be hard to quantify for some reason. On Deepwater Horizon, there's got to be some data that talks about how many billions of dollars in damage it did, or how many fish that it killed, or how many waterfowl were affected, or the consequence of the beaches. You don't have any of that. You just mentioned that there's 3.19 million barrels of oil that were released as a result of the Deepwater Horizon leak. And then we get this new leak that you talk about, which doesn't sound like it's quite as significant. They say it's being allowed to disperse, and you say, so there's naturally going to be some harm, and I'm not sure why there's going to be some harm. If nature can disperse it, why is that a problem? There's a presupposition that there's going to be harm there, and I think you need to have more argument on that. On the argument about the atmospheric pollution, that sounds like it's more about the users of the material rather than the production of the material, and that's where you get into that second argument about maybe we could replace it with electric or ethanol, cellulose-based ethanol kinds of products. And if you're going to make that argument, you need to document it and provide some evidence on those particular points. There's a lot of reading in the presentation. You need to talk to us a little bit more to build your credibility. All right, thank you.